Speaking of Pianists by Abram Chasins, published by Alfred A. Knopf, New York, 1957. Narrated by Penny Johnson. In retrospect. The men I have been writing about worked their miracles more frequently and to a greater degree than any other pianists I ever heard, but not always, and not in all ways. These paragons had their limitations. Hofmann's were least apparent because he knew them so well, and because he had the wisdom to avoid public competition with others on their ground. For example, he played very little Bach outside of the splendid organ works in stylistically absurd transcriptions by Liszt and Tausig. Hofmann realized that this was not Bach's language, that performances of the harpsichord and clavichord works on a comparable level with those works which fully belonged to him would take a special scholarship, one that had not been available to him in his youth. Attaining it would mean scrapping lifelong habits, starting afresh. This was clearly not for him. His kinship to Mozart was confined to the dramatic fantasies and the Lisztian transformation of Don Giovanni. Although Brahms was not so conspicuously absent from Hofmann's programs as from those of his master Anton Rubinstein, Hofmann played mainly the three Rhapsodies and the Handel variations. He avoided the Paganini variations and the monumental concertos and sonatas. Even this greatest of Chopinists found stumbling blocks among the etudes, especially the A minor, opus 10, number 2, the studies in thirds, sixths, and octaves, and the prodigious Winter Wind. No one claimed that he could not play them, no one, that is, but Hofmann. He had heard Backhaus, Levin, Godowsky, and Friedman in these works. That was quite enough to keep him from performing them publicly. Hofmann had a gigantic repertoire. As the years went by, he used it less and less, but his audiences must share partial responsibility for the stereotyped programs of the later years. They doted on certain Hofmann pieces in much the same way that men with a closet full of ties constantly select a few favorites. Especially did Hofmann's public anticipate encore time. Then they would get not only what amounted to a Chopin recital, but also a generous compliance with their shouted demands for Rubinstein's Melody in F, Moszkowski's Caprice Espagnole, Schubert's Marche Militaire, Rachmaninoff's C-sharp minor prelude, Mendelssohn's Spring Song, and many other less than profound items. This post-recital ritual led to one of Godowsky's most acidulous remarks. After an hour of beloved war horses had inflamed the Hofmann fans to an insatiable and hysterical pitch, Mrs. Godowsky started to leave. "Aren't you going?" she asked her husband, who gave no sign of rising from his seat. "I'm not budging from this spot," answered the naughty Popsy, "until Joseph plays the Rosary." Godowsky was a genuine paradox as the pedantic perfectionist and audacious iconoclast, the precisionist who would take your head off for the slightest deviation from a text, was equally quick to point out, with the air of discharging a humanitarian duty, where Beethoven or Schumann had been careless or inept, and how we owe it to them to correct their errors. Godowsky altered such errors with the conviction of a man who looks over your shoulder while you tally your bank book and discovers a provable mistake in subtraction. Stating that the classicists were only human and not above a fall from grace, Godowsky was fond of citing great musical material that had been transformed to advantage, from Bach's and Handel's free utilization of other composers' ideas to Ravel's orchestration of pictures at an exhibition. In Godowsky's words, Ravel realized for Mussorgsky a fulfillment of ideals which Mussorgsky was obviously incapable of realizing for himself. If one ventured to point out the difference between a recreation in which the transcriber assumes full responsibility and arbitrary corrections superimposed upon an otherwise original text, Godowsky said, There are few things so flawless that they cannot be improved. As he improved a classic, whether by slight or by radical means, Godowsky was confident that a composer whose solutions differed from his had committed at least a miscalculation, and perhaps even a downright blunder. We used to say that Godowsky, like nature, abhorred a vacuum. The characteristic is less favorable to art than to nature, and Godowsky, the transcriptionist, was most vitally affected by it. In too many of his transcriptions, in Schubert's F minor Moment Musical, Albenitz's Tango and Triana, Weber's Invitation to the Dance, Schubert's Songs and others, the over-luxuriant textures, the harmonic and contrapuntal complexities are such that the very character of the originals is all but lost. As teacher, Godowsky unwittingly inhibited many musicians through his relentless insistence on the letter rather than the spirit of music. His inordinate demands drove them to a preoccupation with details, with fingers and notes. Convinced that anyone who could not take it would not amount to much anyway, Godowsky was ceaselessly picking blemishes and caricaturing weaknesses. I witnessed many painful scenes as gifted pianists became so tense and rattled that hysterics, nature's merciful device, finally released their overtaxed nerves. When that happened, Godowsky would punish himself severely, growing abjectly remorseful and showing it with deep tenderness. An hour later, he would be at it again, helpless against his contempt for inadequacy, his frenzied pursuit of perfection. Godowsky always said that he played best on the platform, stimulated by audiences. Perhaps this was true of his youth, but no public performance, no recording I ever heard, matched the freedom and beauty of Godowsky's playing in an intimate atmosphere in the presence of admiring friends and colleagues. I am not alone in this opinion. One night he played for a few of us his newly composed Java Suite. It was sorcery, nothing less. Later, when I was walking Hofmann back to his hotel, he said, "Never forget what you heard tonight. Never lose the memory of that sound. There's nothing like it in this world. It is tragic that the public has never heard Popsy as only he can play." When I met Rachmaninoff, I was unprepared to have my faith in the omniscience of Hofmann or Godowsky shaken, for I knew Rachmaninoff admired them deeply. Yet he started almost immediately to warn me that academic theories belong to criticism, not to creation or interpretation. "Your master," Rachmaninoff said, "is a pianistic genius, the greatest of all. Godowsky is another kind of genius, but both of them think that teaching can produce what it can only improve." These were hard sentiments for me to swallow. They related to the first argument I dared to wage against him on the grounds that his refusal to teach was an indefensible abrogation of an artistic obligation. Apart from a few favorites among personal friends, Rachmaninoff had very little interest in musical education, in the musical scene generally. He was unconvinced that teaching could produce anything of vital significance, unaware of the damage done through the naive faith that talent alone is sufficient to gain mastery, maturity, and inevitable recognition. Rachmaninoff's interest lay in the finished product, not in potentiality, in composition and performance, period. Rachmaninoff, the pianist, had a particular blind spot. Except for a handful of works, Chopin's language was alien to him. Somehow the sham heroics one finds in the unfledged composer of the Prelude, the gushing sentimentality that saturates his elegiac trio, brooded over most of his Chopin playing. I have a melancholy remembrance of his performances of Chopin's 24 preludes. Throughout, there was an amazing absence of Rachmaninoff's distinctive strengths. His rhythmic precision deserted him. The lyrical pieces sounded whimpering, the bold ones inflated. The music and its interpreter both lost their essential traits. Later I heard Rachmaninoff play mazurkas, waltzes, nocturnes, and études with a reckless loss of exactness and elegance. They did not emerge even as inspired misconceptions. They were stylistically artificial. I was pained and puzzled, unable to realize at the time how polarized were Rachmaninoff's Byronic romanticism and Chopin's poetic classicism. Arthur Schnabel was often embarrassed by the anointed who regarded him as their messiah and his every word as holy writ. Yet he indulged in assertive oration and peremptory opinion that put a dangerous strain upon the non-anointed, even upon their willingness, short of worship, to recognize him as a noble artist and a candid man. "I am a simple musician," Schnabel would say, and say it with the air of an emperor. His book, Reflections on Music, alienated many who were entirely disposed to succumb to the Schnabel magic. Even the most spiritual appetites have been known to acquire indigestion from the purple prose and the "let's get down on our knees, we're on hallowed ground" attitude. I regret it because it is so contrary to the innately modest man whose art at its greatest had an artless simplicity. When it was less than that, Schnabel could be so careless about technical details that a performance or a recording would sound more like a prima vista reading than a prepared execution. In lyrical movements, he could become introverted and meditative to the point of losing connective momentum, of producing unconscionable boredom. Once, obviously aware that he had lost communication with an audience that coughed profusely during the music and applauded perfunctorily afterward, he rose slowly, bowed very slowly, and then fixed his public with a hard look. The look said, "You are unworthy to be in this temple." Schnabel was out to serve Beethoven, and Schnabel's conviction about him, not to entertain the customers. He had laid down his life for this. They, only the price of admission. He made sure that they knew it. In retrospect, I see the personal differences and distinctions between Hofmann, Godowsky, Rachmaninoff, and Schnabel as negligible in the light of their commonly assumed guardianship of standards and trusteeship of traditions. Each had the highest concept of artistic responsibility and very much the same instrumental and interpretative destinations. Each made his choice of the road to the journey's end according to his own endowment and environment. Each possessed abundantly the indefinable and incalculable elements of art. We can also see that each knew limitation and frustration, and that these brought not only suffering, but also the power of understanding which suffering can bring, and the greater ability to illumine humanity's common struggles and ultimate hopes. Moreover, had it not been for the frailties of these superhuman singers, the gods might well have been sorely tempted in their jealousy. Counter subjects. Concerning Donald Francis Tovey. Among the men who, each in his way, revealed to me the very heart of the piano, only Hutchison and Hofmann were my teachers in the sense of giving me consecutive lessons. Godowsky and Rachmaninoff were my mentors rather than my masters. Schnabel was more a symbol who represented the conscience of music. He was also an artist I revered, a teacher who generously offered to hear me several times and proffered invaluable comments, a man with whom I was privileged to associate on relatively few occasions, but under unusually stimulating circumstances. I assume that I share with many others the inability to place the exact moment when tutelage ended and independent judgment began. Despite my abject devotion to these giants, or perhaps because of it, I made many conscious and unconscious efforts to free myself from their vast authority, from the need of their assistance and approval. But even more serious than the desire for independence, I was beginning to feel out of my depth. The priceless lessons and associations had stuffed me with a rich and heterogeneous stock of materials that I was unable to collate. My own identity remained concealed. My own problems remained unsolved. My ideas were not my own ideas, and they were in conflict. I felt that I had to work out my own salvation. I knew that I was somehow looking through the wrong end of a telescope, through interpretation to music, and that music was anything but clear to me. This may sound strange, coming from one who had already composed quite a number of published works. But before that I had studied harmony, counterpoint, and form with Percy Getsch's, analysis and composition with Reuben Goldmark. Both were musical scholars, faithful teachers, and delightful human beings. Both had accepted and taught compositional theories as though they were scientific facts established before music existed. The fugue schemes I learned would not relate to any Bach fugue I played. The sonata form doctrines rarely resembled the works I knew. The rules seemed to apply merely to textbook exercises. Finding them unworkable in my own creative efforts, finding them inapplicable to the masterpieces I loved, and finding myself tied up in knots of confusion, I stopped going for lessons. My regained interest in musical analysis, my final ability to shift my emphasis from performance to composition, did not come about in one dramatic flash, or with the mere passing of time, or without further assistance. It crystallized slowly, following an unexpected encounter with a man, with a mind, I should say, a mind that let in a pure light, that took nothing for granted, that compelled me to re-examine everything. During 1931, I returned to Europe to fulfill a recording contract and concert engagements. As good luck would have it, London was first on my itinerary, and there I found Donald Francis Tovey giving a series of recitals at the Wigmore Hall. Hearing him and meeting him affected my entire view of music. Later I shall speak of his unique playing. First I want to say that his was the most erudite and sparkling mind I ever knew. He talked exactly as he wrote, his wisdom peppered with unregenerate wit. Learning that he planned to stay in London during his remaining concerts, I made a confounded nuisance of myself until he agreed to see me professionally, primarily to help me in compositional analysis. "Very well," he said at last. "I suggest that you investigate a Mozart score in the Eulenburg edition and bring it along with a readable analysis." When he saw the results of my investigation of Mozart's Piano Concerto in C, K503, Tovey said, "Good heavens, it's almost fallacious enough to serve as a model text for one of your American music appreciation rackets." That was only the beginning. Imagine the shock of a fairly established pianist, composer, and teacher on discovering that he had not yet learned to read a score, in Tovey's meaning of the term. Of course, my head teemed with hundreds of pages of memorized music, but it took no more than a few of his searching questions to tell me how lightly and uncomprehendingly I had skipped through them. Analogous to the abrupt pianistic awakening that Hofmann's first words brought was the new awareness that I had been shackled by a statistical view of form, cowed into a servile faith in the printed word and in theoretical teaching that classified art forms as though they were geometric forms. Having been taught to expect masterworks of a species to conform to the rules, to behave as though their structures had been rigidly determined before the music was conceived, I had fixed my attention on their familiar elements and obvious resemblances. In the process, I had overlooked their most significant differences. In fact, I had deliberately closed my eyes and ears to their uncomfortable existence in sublime ignorance of the primary point that virtually every great artwork is a special case. This fundamental fact, and many others no less vital to an accurate observation of art forms, had escaped me completely. The discovery was so humiliating and upsetting that I have confided this transient but momentous experience to few people. The wounds to my vanity were hardly healed by the excitement of learning. Roused to rescrutinize terminology, tonality, style, and structure, stimulated to reread textbooks and to restudy the works they analyzed, I was painfully jolted to find how often the internal evidence of individual works contradicted the a priori generalizations of the academic orthodoxy that I had found innavigable but had not really questioned. The largest part of my reading time was naturally spent in poring over every word from Tovey's untiring pen which I could find. His analytical work earlier that year had included program notes for Bach's B minor Mass in connection with an Edinburgh performance under his direction. When he showed it to me, he said, "It's far from complete, but common sense forbids me to tackle every element involved. The truth must be faced that Bach's scholarship is full of contradictions, especially regarding ornamentation. Now, there's a fruitful field for you. Why not investigate it?" When he saw my enthusiasm for his suggestion, he said, "Let me give you one piece of practical advice. If you ever manage the time for research and find some of the annihilating things I think you'll find, don't discuss them with any pious professors. Present them only to your most scrupulously musical and intelligent colleagues, and to them with the rarest tact you can summon. Even then, I dare say, you'll often know how it must feel to slap a porcupine." The comment was characteristically humorous, sagacious, and prophetic. I recalled it ruefully about a decade later when Serge Koussevitzky, who was to conduct the B minor Mass at Tanglewood, invited me to edit the score and parts and to give a series of preliminary lectures before his orchestra, chorus, and soloists. The orchestra numbered many faculty members of the school, the chorus many of its students. It was at this temple of learning that I found the spirit of inquiry hailed with apathy or hostility by all except Koussevitzky himself, the scholarly harpsichordist Putnam Aldrich, and a handful of scrupulously musical members of the faculty and student body. I still cannot decide whether it was funny or sad to see the panic that seized the soloists when those expensive warblers were confronted with a tiny ornament and a discussion of its expressive potentialities in the Baroque style. Those who howled the loudest were the pious professors from our most venerable universities, whose terrified resistance revealed the extent of their insecurity. But the experience was not entirely unfertile. It persuaded a few that the topic held rewarding possibilities and contributed considerably to my own understanding of the fine art of institutional fraud. Tovey, who took fiendish delight in piercing piety, knew exactly what was in store for me. In fact, nothing ever arose which he did not seem to know to its backbone. Much of it, providentially, is available in his unparalleled prose. Now I must return to that aspect of his career which relates most directly to this book. Tovey was in his middle 50s when I heard him, and his playing did not show the mechanical command of the ranking pianists. Although his busy life permitted limited keyboard practice, he did not sound like one who had ever been a virtuoso, but he had an imaginative insight, a way of conveying the essence of a musical work in totality which enabled him to stride past all but a few of the greatest pianists. He knew by heart practically every significant composition from the 16th century through the 19th. If this sounds like a sophomoric exaggeration, read Mary Grierson's biography of Tovey, wherein she relates that Professor Newell of Cambridge once asked Tovey how long he thought it would take him to play from memory everything he knew, playing 8 hours a day. Tovey answered, "Oh, about 4 weeks." Then, thinking it over, he corrected himself and added, "No, I think it would take 8 weeks, or 7 at least." Pablo Casals said, "Never did I mention one work of the symphonic, operatic, choral, chamber music, or solo literature which Tovey didn't sit right down and illustrate flawlessly from memory at the piano, starting at the exact point under discussion." When I mentioned Tovey to George Enesco, he crossed himself. Everything Tovey played revealed his colossal musicianship, divulged something one had never before known or heard quite that way. When he played Beethoven's Diabelli variations or the Handel Brahms variations, he produced a cumulative effect, a successive impetus that made every variation progress along one propulsive line, with the structural inevitability and excitement of a detective story. Tovey's belief in a masterpiece as a type of infinity, his understanding of the force and nature of its individuality, his intense desire to demonstrate the most important aspects of its structure, took your mind off everything but the music itself. You forgot the pianist, you could not think of his interpretation. Here was not a performer, but an inspired medium, proving the pure coherence and self-consistency of a masterwork. Although I will not attempt here to discuss Tovey as a composer, the few works of his which I have seen, not heard, lead me to disagree with those who disparage his creative gift. I think it more likely that his laboratory and clinical investigations as an observer and author overburdened his imagination and impeded his own creative talent and activity. It was inevitable that his greatest fame should rest on his intellectual powers, on the unique analyses he left, which enable us to discern more accurately and deeply the organizational originality of genius. On interpretation. "Nothing happens in performance," said the realistic Toscanini, "that doesn't happen somewhere in the preparation, except the bad things." Such a statement, coming from an artist whose power to summon the inspiration of the moment was unsurpassed, carries abundant implication that neither instinct nor luck can be relied upon to produce sustained excellence. Precise planning, conscious knowledge, and refined skills are all required to elevate muscular facility into technique, taste into judgment, perception into culture, and vision into conviction and communication. Genius does not appear upon this earth in full bloom. In the beginning it is talent, and talent is not quite so rare as it is generally believed to be. Its fulfillment is the rarity, for fulfillment depends not alone upon the quality and quantity of talent, but also upon its direction and upon the degree to which talent is cultivated, guided, and utilized. Natural gifts are but the intuitive seeds of art. They must be carefully tended and prudently exposed to every fertilizing element if they are to flower. Otherwise, far more often than not, we find both creative and recreative gifts stunted in their growth, withered, or dead. But let us assume an ideal circumstance. A manifoldly gifted pianist is beautifully nurtured to become a performing artist of high caliber. Strange to say, the greater his imaginative force, the stronger his personality, the more he must face the most troublesome of interpretative problems. In what way and to what degree is he privileged to bestow his hard-won individuality upon the music he plays? The mere fact that the problem can be stated in this way shows how far we have come from the days when the argument was wagered whether a performer had any right to introduce anything beyond a faithful representation of the composer's intentions as indicated in the score. Although it is still being heatedly debated in certain metaphysical quarters, most of us recognize that the personality of the interpreter is an ineradicable fact, and therefore undebatable. The real problem an eternal problem in art remains one of proportion. Before we tackle it, I must quote a pertinent remark that Richard Strauss made, which keeps coming to mind. "A musical score," he said, "may have more or less than appears on the page, but it is always something not apparent on the page. A printed page is an imperfect blueprint of a conception. It is a lifeless diagram that awaits resurrection by an interpreter. His is the last judgment, just so long as his recreative powers remain relevant to the spirit and substance of a work." The process of interpretation begins with an accurate observation of the printed page. It is the artist's first duty, but it is a minimum obligation. It has been absurdly magnified to become the major criterion of an artist's dedication. Far be it from me to deny that the average recital furnishes appalling evidence that precise score reading is a skill obviously beyond the average player. Yet it is merely a starting point, and the musician who holds absolute fidelity to the score as his highest interpretational goal holds an erroneous ideal. It is erroneous because it is based on the untenable premises that music is born to the composer in a fixed and inflexible mold, that he is able to transcribe to the page the very sounds he conceived in their entirety and with exactitude, and that there is but one authentic way to interpret a work of art. No one knows better than the composer the limitations and imperfections of the printed score. Within the 2 centuries or so during which composers have been reasonably able to anticipate publication and performance, they have written and edited their scores with ever-increasing care. Nevertheless, their most painstaking efforts are defeated by music's notational inadequacy and loose terminology. No one knows better than the composer that the richest works of art are those with the widest gamut of expression, the greatest multiplicity of meanings. Only the composer knows the difference between abstract sounds, as they spring up in the imagination, and those same sounds translated first into symbols and later into performance. The inability to transfer to the printed page exactly what the composer conceived in the mysterious ecstasy of inspiration leads us to contemplate what the effect on interpretation might be if it were possible to hear the old masters play their own works. What would we not learn, especially from composers such as Mozart and Beethoven, who were also the greatest pianists of their day? The very thought makes one's head swim, makes one curse humanity's ill luck that mechanical genius and artistic genius did not flourish simultaneously. But apart from the sheer fascination of hearing a composer interpret his own music, apart from the stylistic and textual knowledge to be derived from the opportunity, the experience is a revealing lesson in music's unique dependence upon the interpreter. Many of us who love music have heard in actual or recorded performances Richard Strauss, Sibelius, and Stravinsky conduct their compositions, or Ravel, Mettner, Prokofiev, Hindemith, and Gershwin play theirs. Whatever was to be learned from the enriching experience, it was certainly not that a printed score is sacrosanct. And it was distinctly not, judging from how differently they played the same works at different times, that a composer's reading constitutes the inviolable tradition from which deviation is inadmissible. The rendition by the great old masters of their own music must remain a matter of speculation. But we know enough about their works and about their improvisational procedures to conclude that nothing could be more audacious than to suggest that a Mozart or a Beethoven, for example, was not the freest of artists, or that they would ever have permitted anything to obstruct emotional truth as it arose spontaneously in performance. Posterity will not have to rely upon speculation and deduction regarding the masters of our electronic age. In our lifetime, for the first time in musical history, there became available the recorded interpretations of an entire category of major works by a significant composer who was also a significant performer. Sergei Rachmaninoff was the one composer-pianist of our time whose interpretative gifts fully matched his creative gifts. His RCA Victor recordings as soloist with the Philadelphia Orchestra in his 4 piano concertos and Rhapsody are illuminating documents that settle some important questions. Let us check the scores as we listen to these recordings and see what we can observe. Does Rachmaninoff rigidly obey his own metronome marks to the numeral? He does not. Do the composer and his favorite collaborators adhere devotionally to the printed dynamics? They do not. And when we hear so drastic a change as appears in the last movement of the second concerto, where the woodwind section, marked pianissimo, emerges fortissimo, it becomes obvious that public performance brings not only inspirational flashes, but also practical realizations that demand anything from slight alterations to flat rejections of the text. Finally, can we find symbols in the score which would enable an interpreter to achieve the glowing nuance, inner phrasing, and subtle accentuation, the exquisite transition from one tempo to another, or from one texture or expressive range to another, or any of the other effects that ravish our ears? Not anywhere. There are no such symbols. What we do find is that Rachmaninoff, the interpretative genius, brings to Rachmaninoff, the composer, the identical, disciplined originality that he brings to the communication of a work by Beethoven or Schumann. He has a way with music and with the piano which is all his own, right down to anarchistic mannerisms. The most personal and surprising effects emerge with such coherent relation to the whole that they stand vindicated as concomitants of the entire structure. Such playing is not performance, it is recreation. We now ask ourselves, what are the applicable values of this authentic document? Is it to be regarded as the model for others to imitate as closely as possible? We see immediately, if we recognize individuality as the distinctive characteristic of a great interpreter, that imitation is impossible, even were it desirable. What then is to be extracted from the composer's approach to his own music? Before a performer's imagination can take flight, he must be in full possession of every possible fact relating to the music he hopes to communicate. Here is where the composer's interpretations become invaluable. Rachmaninoff's performances of his own works provide the authentic basis on which we can verify compositional style, judge tempo, markings, and dynamic signs, correct misprints, and adjust miscalculations. The composer's readings show us what not to do. They chart the boundaries of our liberty. They disclose what would lead us too far afield. Beyond that, the interpreter is on his own. He must go on to realize the music through his own image, his own truth. Of course, it will vary from the composer's realization, just as it will vary from that of any other interpreter, for a work of art cannot mean precisely the same thing to two people. The richer a performer's imagination, the greater his command, the deeper his intuition, the more humane his culture, the more he will penetrate and fulfill the potentialities of the music he plays. Should he seek to exploit himself at the expense of the music, should he distort its essential mood or meaning, he will fail. The music itself will give the lie to his deceit. But if he is a master of that art which conceals art, the music will appear to speak for itself. At this point I am pained not to be able to summon the name of the oracle who first said, "If music could speak for itself, it would cry out, 'For heaven's sake, interpret me.'" I myself have lived through this matter on both sides, In my concert-playing days, I played in private sessions to Godofsky, Rachmaninoff, and Ravel many of their works I had been practicing. With the brashness of youth, I took interpretative liberties without apology. I did not hesitate to indulge in some fairly drastic individual ideas that I had concluded were suggested by the spirit of the music, but were not to be found in the text. At no time did I hear any expression of indignation or any suggestion that my alterations were high-handed tamperings with their music. Their first reactions were always curiosity and interest. They did not consider each note or mark a deathless inspiration. Rachmaninoff would say, "Yes, that does sound better," or "I think that change makes the idea clearer and easier to play," or "It is another way of treating my idea, but I must say it is an intriguing one." Once I brought Godofsky a composition of his and played it to him with meticulous observance of his metronome mark. He jumped up in agitation and said, "Oh, no, that's much too slow. Never mind the metronome mark. I put it down as I composed the piece, before I learned it." Ravel, in response to certain pedal effects I had devised for his exquisite sonatine, exclaimed, "Why didn't someone show me that such effects were possible with the sustaining pedal? How many more possibilities it would have suggested to me!" On the other hand, I had the thrilling experience of hearing my own works transformed in recreations by Toscanini, Stokowski, Hofmann, Rachmaninoff, and Horowitz, among others. To take two specific examples, a piano work of mine called Narrative presents some formidable difficulties. At several dramatic points, the text directs the performer to slow down for widely dispersed and unwieldy octaves and chords. I played it that way, and so did every other pianist, because only such allowances of time enabled us to play the notes and attain the climaxes comfortably and clearly. One day, Horowitz played it over for me at his studio. When he came to those bristling passages, he tore right through them at the prevailing speed, explaining that he had ignored my markings because he felt that the climaxes lost their power unless the momentum was maintained. The effect was overwhelming. It had never dawned upon me to ask for it, as I could not possibly imagine a pianist who could play it in tempo. In 1931, Toscanini conducted a work of mine called Parade. At the first rehearsal, I squirmed to hear how I had misgauged the orchestration of an entire section. It was not at all what I had imagined within me. Suddenly, Toscanini turned around. "Chestnuts!" he yelled. He never did learn to pronounce my name. "See me after rehearsal." As we rode in a cab to his apartment at the Astor Hotel, he said, "That middle section, Chestnuts, it is not what you want, is it?" The misery on my face answered him. When we reached his home, he sat down without a word and completely rescored that section. At the second rehearsal, I finally heard the orchestra play exactly what I had heard in my head, but had been unable to translate to the page. My interpreter had to realize it for me. The performer is not by accident called the interpreter. His first duty is actually to interpret what he sees on the page and translate the mute symbols into sound. Then he must envision what the composer really felt and thought, reaching far beyond the creator's ability to notate completely his expressive intent. Only then is the interpreter performing his highest function, to become the partner of the composer, to breathe life upon music through the power of his own vision and technique. Guided by scholarship and integrity, not by willful caprice or exhibitionism, the interpreter develops ideas and ideals of his own and directs them to finding the best ways and means to communicate his acquired beliefs on behalf of the music's primal message. Should he conclude that its full realization requires him to depart from the text or to turn its directions inside out or upside down, he must do this. He cannot do otherwise. Not with conviction. In the art of interpretation, the power to create truth is the first law. Also, as Strauss said, it is the last judgment. Wherever I have experienced interpretative illumination, I have found it illustrated in the piano literature in greatest measure from the artists I wrote about in my opening sections. The ultimate proof of their principles was in their performances. Once we absorb these principles, once we consciously respond to their application, we become extremely sensitized to their absence and to the lowered artistic result it inevitably yields. In the hands of a master, we are tempted to think of them as platitudes rather than anything so grandiose as principles. It is primarily in their absence that we learn to what extent these principles in action are the life-blood that courses through an inspired recreation. Such recreation is unique. It cannot be imitated. It cannot be adopted. It must vary from artist to artist. Therefore, we must accept every originality, provided that it does not violate the essential style and character of a creation. How can we discover them, especially when they belong to the dead past? I can assure the reader that there is far more authoritative testimony available than most artists have ever been willing to examine. Any performance that distorts the inherent evidence of a score is obviously deficient. One that displays textual fidelity but little more comes under the heading of honest workmanship, and damned lifeless it is by itself. A performance that grasps and communicates musical material with conviction, individuality, and command is in the category of mastery. But more yet is possible as it is rare. The interpretation that illumines a composition through intensified meanings and freshly revealing views of its truths. On teaching. Although I find it hard to recollect my actual view of music as it kept changing through the years, I do know that before my exposure to each of the aforementioned men, I had no means whatsoever of knowing any of the things they articulated or demonstrated. Each new association initiated a magnetic conversion. Everything I learned made my brain spin. Everything I heard burned into my heart. I realize now that I was far more alert to the insuperable sounds and standards before me than I was to their full import. Actually, I understood meagerly, just about enough to sense what understanding could mean. Hofmann said from time to time, "You won't really know what I'm aiming at for 10 years. The assertion turned out to be flattering. It took much longer, but I was further along than during my earlier studies when I had made no attempt to weigh what I was assimilating, when evaluation had been entirely beyond my equipment and my courage. From the time I went to Hofmann, I began to see, dimly at first, that this kind of teaching provided ultimate goals, not ways and means. I was expected to absorb rather than to accept ideas, to appraise them and to determine, apart from their validity, whether or not they were for me. When it came to applying principles, developing physical skills, and realizing aims pianistically, I was on my own. How liberated I felt, how certain I was that at last I had gained artistic independence. It was a thrilling but temporary illusion, and Hofmann was quick to straighten me out on that point. Actually, I was retracing a familiar pattern, floating on clouds of contagion and identification, swept along by the inspirational force of great guidance. Few are the responsive pupils who do not identify at some point with glamorous teachers. In turn, teachers who awaken us, even when they claim no eminence, often become one with whatever they awaken within us. The unsung heroes and heroines who guide our elementary steps rarely have the chance to stir us in this way. Confronted with untutored pupils, responsible teachers work to build a solid foundation. They try to create enthusiasm, or at least not to kill it, while they explain essentials, supply methods, and inculcate disciplines. It is a sacrificial and thankless task. I had to teach for many years to appreciate adequately the angelic patience of Mrs. Tapper, the precise technical training of Epstein, and especially the erudition and lucidity of Hutcheson's mellow mind. Without their tolerant instruction and altruistic interest, I doubt that further opportunities would have come to me at all. Artist teachers can generate fervor. They can transform routine work into a passionate search. They can lead us to revel in realms infinitely more spacious than anything they or we have within us. They can catapult us into the imaginative life and quicken us to experience art as an ecstasy to be treasured and loved. With them we live in eloquence without syntax, in music itself. If artist teachers can provide such seminal force, why is there so lamentably large a percentage of casualties among their gifted students? There are many reasons. At the top of the list is the blunt fact that inspirational teaching can be a precarious as well as revealing experience unless the student is technically, intellectually, and emotionally ready for it. Otherwise, the vision that awaits him may be hopelessly beyond his capacity to approach. The challenges it poses may produce paralysis instead of liberation. The time must be ripe, the foundation firm, or the white light may be merely blinding. When the golden opportunity arises, the last thing to enter the enraptured pupil's mind is the question of whether or not he is prepared to make the most of it. Such objectivity cannot be expected of a starry-eyed youngster. It is almost as unrealistic to expect it of the average ambitious parent. The temptation to grasp an opportunity prematurely is far more common than the ability to forego it. The artist teacher alone must decide this vital question. The degree to which he assumes this responsibility is the measure of his integrity. No one can censure a master for removing himself from rudimentary processes and step-by-step supervision. He is fully justified in that. He has something else to contribute, something unique. It can work miracles, and it can also work havoc. The subtler it is, the greater the possibility that a student's inferences will misinterpret its implications. It can go frightfully wrong if it is not instilled under precise surveillance and constant adjustment. The absence of vigilance is a form of malpractice, of course, and it exists on all levels of teaching. It is always reprehensible, but somehow it is most shocking when it comes from those who trade on their acclaim as performers to entice hopeful aspirants as pupils. It is explainable only in the light of a remark once made to me by an international merchant of music who sells inspirational shots in the arm en masse between concert engagements. "Teaching," he said, "is a very good busyness." Obviously, a frustrating aftermath of high-level study may be entirely the fault of a pupil who fails to assume his responsibilities. But even when everything is just as right as it can be, when a talented and well-prepared student goes to a conscientious master at the perfect moment, the results cannot be guaranteed. Many other matters are involved which I shall touch upon in later chapters. To return to my own studies at alpine altitudes, I found Hofmann at a most fortunate moment. The circumstances of my first 4 months of lessons provided the leisure for him to keep an alert eye and ear on every phase of my work. Frequently I went off the deep end, and he had to fish me out. I recall at one point being so carried away by interpretative and instrumental principles that I was convinced that a firm grasp of these principles could enable anyone, no matter how limited his talents, to acquire emotional force and intuitive power. When I told Hofmann so, he became red with rage. "You are dead wrong," he said. "There are no such principles." But immediately he qualified and amplified his statement, carefully explaining that what he said was quite another thing from saying that a consummate artistry is achievable without technical and intellectual resources. "Anyone who thinks that," he said, "anyone fearful of ruining talent through exposure to disciplines and knowledge is equally misled." Although every artist tells of some inspiring personality, some dramatic encounter that first inflamed his imagination and made music come alive, another fact strikes me even more forcibly. It is the emphasis placed on sheer craftsmanship by almost all the artists I ever knew who had the divine fire, their insistence on the need for a musician to know what is knowable about his art and every relevant subject. I am almost equally struck, in an opposite way, to discover how many practicing musicians are loath to probe their art or to learn the salient facts of their profession. Those most lacking in instinct are always most resistant to ideas. My own practical experience has shown that the finest artists have both feet planted firmly on the ground while they breathe the loftiest air, that they constantly maintain a self-imposed obligation to nourish their natural gifts with hard-earned scholarship and a ceaseless quest for technical and emotional freedom. Something in them or in their arduous lives may occasionally keep them, as teachers, from demanding as much from their students. Nevertheless, their philosophy, methods, and achievements are all there for the skillful and enkindled to observe and to emulate. Observation and inference and deduction all need to be more heavily invoked in the pupil-teacher relationships of our hectic world. When I spoke of the galaxy of musicians who were not only watchful masters but also sympathetic friends, I spoke of another period. The environment was different then. There was more time, or there seemed to be, time to impart and to learn, time to linger, to consider and reconsider, time to lose oneself in the effort to find oneself. There was even time for fraternity, for great men and busy men to assist others patiently in their struggles and aspirations, and time even for human exchange and understanding. So it was in the company of artists who were alien to the spirit of the changing world around them, whose unchangeable ideals were contagious and catalytic, because our relations were so full, because as altruistic mentors those men were so near and dear and of such incalculable inspiration to me, my feelings about them can never be wholly objective. Further, the degree to which the artistic principles and standards they exemplified are illustrated by others has remained the critical foundation of my pianistic thinking. I think it only fair to admit to these facts, so that the reader may fully discount them as we go along to meet other artists, some also from the past, but mostly those who are playing for us today.